we see about Hugo Chavez, and the attempt to darken his legacy could not be more relevant. I do not know if people today saw the disgusting picture on the BBC website with Hugo Chavez put next to Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein. We need to be aware in this period ahead that we are going to need to build solidarity more than ever, that we are going to need to tell the truth about Venezuela. So please don't leave today and just go home. Of course this is a sad moment, but Venezuela and the Bolivarian Revolution needs our support now more than ever. With that in mind, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce someone that I'm proud to call my own MP, a fighter for peace and global justice unparalleled in Britain, Jeremy Corbyn MP.
Thank you, Matt. I was saying to a friend a moment ago, in memory of Hugo Chavez, let's buy a really good PA system, okay? This is the day that none of us wanted to see. This is the memorial none of us wanted to attend. This is the event we hoped would never happen. And it is obviously tragic and awful that someone so young, with so much left to give, so much leadership to inspire with for so much longer, has been taken from us because cancer took him. Now, we're meeting in the shadow of Simón Bolívar. Bolívar, who lived in London, worked out the liberation of Latin America from a house in Warren Street, and wanted a continent that was free from empire, where there was no slavery, where every language would be recognized, where every culture would be respected, where every faith would be tolerated. That was the continent that Bolívar wanted. He didn't want a continent of landowners and speculators, of multinational corporations and thieving banks that destroyed the lives and livelihoods of so many people. He had an inspiration of something very, very different. Tragically, Bolívar, like Chavez, died too young. And shortly after the independence was achieved in the early 1820s of most countries, the US imposed the Monroe Doctrine on Latin America, effectively calling the whole continent its backyard. And the history of Latin America is littered with those that stood up and fought back, those that were killed, and the coups that took place to destroy progressive governments. One can think of so many, and so many heroic people that stood up. And you can think of all the thousands that died in the repressions that followed. The 25,000 that died in Operation Condor, the death of Salvador Allende, the deaths of Venezuelans who stood up against corruption and stood up against autocratic rule in their country. You can think of them all over the continent. Cuba survived. Ironically alone, it survived and stood out. So when Chavez became president of Venezuela, he was a president of a powerful country with huge oil reserves. And he could have done lots of things. He could have gone in lots of directions. To be quite honest, he was a bit of an unknown quantity to most people at that time. But his inspiration and his whole life was growing up in poverty, his parents barely able to get enough to eat, a poverty-stricken grandmother. He wanted food for all. He wanted education for all. He wanted health care for all. He wanted opportunities for all young people. And in his memory, I think one of the greatest things is the Bolivarian Youth Orchestra, an orchestra of young people from Venezuela who 20 years ago wouldn't have even known what a violin was, never mind being allowed to pick one up and play it. It's that inspiration of freeing people from ignorance that we will remember him with. But beyond that, he set up the Alba Pact. The Alba Pact was seminal. It's historic. It was changing. The US hegemony over Latin America was finished. The alliance of Ecuador, Bolivia, Venezuela and Cuba, and many other countries that have since joined, shared wealth, conquered poverty, provided health care, provided education, provided housing, provided hope, and provided inspiration. And I've met so many poor people in Mexico, in Central America, in South America, whose governments do not share the Venezuelan values, whose governments are not dedicated towards conquering poverty, who saw in Chavez something different. It's a big character on a world stage, speaking with their voice for them, not for the multinationals, the neocons and the warmongers in the north. So let's remember Chavez for all that he achieved, and stand today with the people of Venezuela, who've themselves seen their way out of poverty, but nevertheless see the enemies all around them, the rich and powerful and the wealthy in the world, who see in the death of Chavez, as they put it ever so diplomatically, a great opportunity to change things in Venezuela. Well, I think the million on the streets of Caracas last night showed that in their millions, the people of Venezuela are not going back to corruption, to autocracy, to an army that fires on the working class on the streets, that shoots strikers, that bans trade unions and denies poor people education. This is a changed moment, and in a period of a unipolar world, Chavez strode the world, spoke up for the Palestinians, spoke up for the poor around the world, and in inspiration to all of us fighting back against austerity and neoliberal economics in Europe, showed us there is a different and a better way of doing things. It's called socialism, it's called social justice, and it's something that Venezuela has made a big step towards. Huge steps still to be made, no doubt about that. But in Chavez, let's remember someone who stood up, was counted, was inspiring, is inspiring, and in his death we will march on to that better, just, peaceful and hopeful world. Thank you.
We have one more message to be read out and one final speaker shortly. Well, I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank you all for coming, first of all, and also take this opportunity to thank our stewards and volunteers who, without this help that people give us on a voluntary basis, and I can see so many people here today who've done so much to help the VSC over the years, it would not be possible to carry on our work, and it would not be possible to honour the legacy of Hugo Chavez. So I'd like to very much thank all those volunteers and all of you for coming today. As I said, I've got one more message to read out. We then have a final speaker, and then our comrade John from Venezuela is going to lead us in a few chants